Hello, Susan Corbett Custom Machine Quilting. Today we're going to look at a Beth Dutton quilt. My client and I decided to forego any design inspiration from the Yellowstone TV show. Instead, we sat down and were looking at various motifs, and we settled on this as our inspiration for the 9-patch. Really traditional quilting, and then this contemporary swirly design for the alternate blocks with background quilting. As usual, the first thing I want to do is stabilize the quilt. It's pretty large, so I'm doing ditch quilting in between the blocks. I'm using my long ruler, my gam guide that came with the machine, when I bought it way back at the end of 1999. I can't imagine doing diagonal lines, real long ones, any other way. So to quilt the block itself, the first thing I did was quilt a line across the middle, across the length of the whole quilt, just because that seemed like the most convenient, easy way to cover a lot of ground in the most efficient manner possible. So that's what I'm doing here. We initially decided to quilt the whole quilt with one color thread. It is one of the many glide grays. Later on, this plan changed, but I'll talk about that later on. So how did we end up with our game plan? Well, this quilt is very square, pointy, angular. I thought it needed some curves to soften the whole thing up. That would be good contrast. It would further be good contrast to have some straight lines in the pacing, where the quilting is not going to be anywhere near as noticeable as it will be in the alternate block. We thought about, going extremely vintage, or, what we ended up with was a combination of traditional and contemporary, because that is another form of really good contrast. I just started showing my client all different kinds of, directions we could go in. We didn't see this quilt as either old-fashioned looking or very contemporary. It's so simple that it could have gone in any direction. It does not look like, very homespun or old-fashioned, so we could use any design inspiration as our jumping off point. And when she saw that swirly design, she fell in love with it, so we ended up just doing that. I could have done really simple continuous curves in the 9-patch. That would get this done really quickly. And I ended up changing the design a little bit. There's what I plan in theory, and then there's what really happens on the quilt itself. So instead of doing concentric squares, I just did some ruler work in one half of that triangle that you end up with once you cross hatch the the gray square, like I'm doing right here. This is what I'm talking about. You just quilt up to the middle and then quilt to the other point, and then quilt to the middle of the whole patch, well, that segment of the patch, and then go back out to the corner. I would have followed the way it was done in the picture if those squares had been larger. I could have done that here, but I thought that would be a lot more work for not too much payoff. And this, I think, looks great. So, as per usual, what I like to do when I'm doing straight line work in blocks is find the most continuous path. One line of stitching, ideally, with as few stops and starts as possible. So I tried lots of different things here to find that continuous path, and what I ended up with was ditch quilting a patch here and there, backtracking to get to where I needed to go. Like you see right there, that got me back to the middle so I could bisect this patch with a straight line. Quilt to the corner, backtrack to the middle, and then quilt the other line. So I'm using my hem gauge to help me figure out where the middle actually is. I'm pretty good at eyeballing, but I wanted it to look as accurate and evenly spaced as possible. And the path to finding the most continuous path is a twisty one. I have to try a lot of things sometimes to figure it out. And then, of course, I'd forget what I'd done. So for most of the quilt, I found a continuous path, but then, I'd mess up here and there and just have to do the best I could. And I want that continuous path for the sake of efficiency. I don't want this part to take a week. And then once you find a groove, it's nice to just quilt block after block as quickly as possible. And that gives me the zen of quilting without having to really think about too much. Straight line work is really good for your non-creative days. Sometimes I'm bursting over with artistic inspiration, and other days I'm just really, really not. So it's nice to have to not have to think. With as much backtracking as there was to do in this block, it was nice to be using a relatively thin thread so that you don't get a really visible buildup of thread in that ditch. What you used for ditch quilting needs to not be seen. It needs to not call attention to itself. This quilt is pretty big. It's like 80 by 80 or something like that. The blocks are large. So initially I thought, well, those blocks won't take that long to do. But they did take a long time to do, which is another reason to look for the quickest path to getting this block done. Initially, when I was figuring out the sequence, I thought, well, this is going to take forever. But once I got a groove going, they seemed to go pretty fast. And it was kind of fun and satisfying to quilt this block over and over, because I thought it gives us a lot of payoff here. It looks really good. And it's really satisfying when you finally get to the end of the block to see the whole thing come together. finally, let's see how that block finishes. It was painful to leave that last little piece unquilted, but it got done in the end. And then we start that all over again. So here I'm going to laser in that swirly motif. And this is how I work. I never use the back of my machine, not for anything. So when I want to use a pattern, I'm doing it all on top of the quilt from the front of the machine. So I've turned the laser light on and I'm aligning the pattern. This is work I don't enjoy doing. It seems like I can never get it lined up properly, no matter what. It takes more time for placement than it does to quilt the motif. And my machine vibrates a whole bunch. So I'm holding that pattern down on the quilt with a big heavy piece of acrylic that I can see through and pinning it in place with some large corsage pins. And even then it wants to move, but I do the best I can. Following a line is not what I do well. I'm a freehander all the way. But sometimes a motif that I can't freehand is the right thing to do for the quilt. So it's not perfect, but I don't know how to do perfect. So I've given up any hope of achieving anything perfect. I just try and do the best I can. I aim for really good. All right, so at some point it's really important to get those threads up out of the way or they'll just cause problems down the road and then I'll have to rip, and I hate doing that. We went with recognizable motif because the fabric color is light enough that it's really going to show up. And I quilted the motif in thread that is darker than the fabric, and that's going to help it show up even more. Now, in the setting triangles around the perimeter of the quilt, I'm quilting half of that motif. So here's a view of how you start. I mean, there will be some partial shapes in there. And I can just run those off of the edge of it. This can be kind of tricky. But here again, do it 10,000 times and you'll figure out what works and what doesn't. Sometimes I think a motif looks kind of strange cut in half. This one still works. It retains the integrity of the design. So it looks really good. I could have put something else in that triangle, but this worked out. And we talked about just doing the motif or adding background quilting, and we decided to put in some background quilting. So I thought I was going to echo this motif 2 or 3 times. I ended up just echoing once, but I knew I wanted to really pay attention to the spacing. There has to be room for that with some other background quilting. So I've left enough space in here to allow for that. I ended up using a paper pattern that I already had, so I didn't have to resize it or anything, which is great. And if you have to resize, it helps to use a proportion wheel and measure, and then take it to a copy store and blow it up or reduce, as the case may be. So see, I left about 1 inch for the echoing. Here's how it's going so far. Looks pretty good, doesn't it? That block is looking wonderful. So some people would probably think you're done. Nope, we're doing background quilting. So here's what that block is going to look like now. With all that, with 1 row of echo and 1 background pass of little bitty swirls of different sizes. Look how it makes that motif leap out of the quilt. That's a very different look. It's a lot more finished, polished, tailored. That's going to be outstanding. So how did I end up with 1 line of echo? I don't know how to explain that. I put 1 in and then thought, well, how does that look? How do I like it? There's some kind of an inner knowing. Is it quilting intuition? I don't know what, but I just thought and felt just do 1 line and then move on to the background. I guess maybe I was rather attached to the idea of background quilting and thought more echo would leave me some really strange little spaces left over. Okay, so it took me a long time to do the quilting in the blocks, and it's going to take a long time to do the background quilting here, but there's not too much of it. So this, I don't know, even though it was time consuming, it was over a lot sooner than I thought it would be. And it's pretty satisfying to go in there and squash that puffy background into this background quilting. So it was kind of a joy to do because with each block you get such big payoff, and I love that part of it. I think that's what makes custom quilting worth it in the end, is that there is a huge payoff in doing all that work. And I had thought I would quilt the motif and the swirls in the same color thread, and then at the last minute that just felt really wrong. So I opted to match the thread instead, and I guess that's more quilting intuition. I don't know. That just seemed like the way to go, and I think that is the way to go. Had the background thread been as dark as the motif, I think, well, you'd have to be really comfortable with that much contrast. Not that it would have been so aggressive and garish. It's not like I was going to use black thread or something severe, but well, I think the background quilting would have taken over. There's a place for that, and I think this quilt just didn't need it. It's dark enough already. And so do you want to call attention to the motif or to the background quilting? I like to use different sizes of swirls. I think it makes it look a lot more interesting. Plus, it's kind of difficult to use all the same size anyway. It just doesn't end up working out like that. You could try, but I think that's a way to make the job unpleasant. There's what you plan, and then there's what really happens. There's what the quilt dictates. So it's a swirl meander I'm doing. And so for a meander, you want it to not line up in rows. It needs to be all over the place. And so varying the size of the swirls helps with that as well. How I would tell you to decide where you're going to go next, that's just a function of doing it. You know, do it 10,000 times and you'll end up teaching yourself how to do it. The swirl is one of my favorite elements. It's one of those shapes like a circle or a straight line that's everywhere in art and nature. It's a basic thing. So learn how to swirl, and it'll serve you extremely well in the long run. It's extremely versatile. Now, is it good contrast to have a swirl background design up against such a swirly block? Well, the contrast is in the size. The swirls in the block are quite large compared to what's happening here. And also the swirl does not require that much thinking about, and that made it go faster. So I think it looks great. From a little bit of a distance, you can't really tell it's a swirl. A lot of times with background quilting, it doesn't matter what you put in there as long as the scale of it is correct. If it's little, I don't know, it could be anything. So lots of background quilting shapes would work in here. And see how quick that went? Look, we're almost done. It's nice to take breaks, you know, after each block. Go get a drink of water or look out the window or, you know, go sit down for a second and then come back fresh and do another one. I don't end up doing this much quilting, you know, all in one fell swoop anyway. I like to break it up. I don't do 4 custom quilts a day. Really good. This client asks me to quilt the date on the quilt somewhere. So I squeezed it in here, you know, almost hiding it within the background quilting. And here is the back. It looks great. So here's the finished product. That's the Dutton quilt, and I think it looks outstanding. We were really happy with it. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.